It is often said that the most powerful messages are not delivered from podiums or printed in books, but passed quietly from one human being to another, carried on trust rather than volume. The message attributed to Elon Musk's mother, May Musk, belongs to that category. It is not dramatic in form, nor sensational in language. It does not shout. Yet, when considered carefully, it has a way of unsettling assumptions people carry about success, struggle, worth, and time. It reframes ambition not as a race, but as a long conversation with oneself. May Musk has lived many lives in one lifetime. She has been a model, a dietitian, a single mother, an immigrant, and a woman who rebuilt her career more than once after circumstances forced her to begin again. Observing her life offers context for the kind of message she would leave behind. It would not be a declaration of victory or a guarantee of triumph. It would be something quieter, forged through endurance rather than spectacle. The message, as it is often recounted, is simple in structure. It suggests that people overestimate how much they should have achieved by a certain age and underestimate what is possible over a longer span of time. This idea alone can disrupt an entire worldview. Many individuals carry a silent clock in their minds, ticking loudly with expectations borrowed from society, peers, or imagined standards. By a certain age, they believe they should be accomplished, stable, recognized, and secure. When reality does not match that internal timetable, disappointment sets in, often accompanied by shame. What May Musk's perspective challenges is the legitimacy of that clock. Her life demonstrates that progress does not move in a straight line and that meaningful success often arrives after detours that look, from the outside, like failure. She did not become an internationally recognized figure in her own right until later in life. She did not enjoy uninterrupted stability. Instead, she adapted repeatedly, making practical decisions when survival demanded it and aspirational ones when opportunity appeared. The power of this message lies in its permission. It quietly grants people the right to be unfinished. In a world that celebrates prodigies and overnight success stories, this permission feels radical. It suggests that being late, slow, uncertain, or interrupted does not disqualify someone from eventually doing something remarkable. It reframes patience not as passivity, but as resilience extended over time. There is also an implicit rejection of comparison. May Musk's message does not encourage people to measure themselves against others who appear more advanced or more visible. Instead, it emphasizes continuity, staying in motion, learning, adjusting, and persisting. The value lies not in outperforming others, but in continuing to move forward despite discomfort and doubt. For Elon Musk, Growing up with such a philosophy likely normalized risk and delayed gratification. When failure is not treated as a final verdict, experimentation becomes possible. When time is viewed as an ally rather than an enemy, bold projects no longer seem reckless, they seem patient. One can see how this outlook could support long-term thinking, the kind required for ventures that take years or decades to mature. Yet the message is not only relevant to those who aspire to build companies or change industries. Its deeper relevance lies in how it speaks to ordinary human fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of wasted potential. Fear that one's best years have already passed. By reframing time as expansive rather than restrictive, the message loosens the grip of those fears. Another subtle element of this perspective is its emphasis on practicality alongside aspiration. Musk has spoken openly about taking whatever work was available to support her family, even when it did not align with her long-term ambitions. This is not romanticized struggle, it is realistic endurance. The message does not suggest waiting passively for ideal conditions. It suggests doing what is necessary now while remaining open to what is possible later. This combination of realism and hope is rare. Many narratives lean too far in one direction. Either they glorify struggle without acknowledging its toll, or they promote optimism without grounding it in responsibility. The message attributed to Musk avoids both extremes. It recognizes hardship without surrendering to it and values ambition without demanding immediate results. There is also a quiet dignity in how this outlook treats age. Rather than portraying youth as the only window for achievement, it acknowledges that experience accumulates value. Skills deepen, judgment improves, and confidence becomes less dependent on external validation. This challenges a culture that often treats aging as decline rather than transformation. When people internalize this message, their relationship with failure changes. Failure becomes information rather than condemnation. A setback is no longer proof of inadequacy but evidence of engagement. One cannot fail at something one never attempts. From this perspective, failure is almost a sign of participation in life rather than a deviation from it. The message also invites reflection on identity. Many people tie their sense of self to a single role or trajectory. When that path collapses, they feel lost. Musk's life demonstrates that identity can be flexible without becoming fragile. One can be many things across a lifetime without betraying oneself. Reinvention is not a denial of the past, it is an extension of it. There is an understated courage in starting over, especially when one is no longer young. Society often praises reinvention when it happens early and quietly discourages it later. This message pushes back against that limitation. It suggests that the courage to begin again does not expire. Another aspect worth noting is the absence of bitterness. Despite the hardships she endured, May Musk's message is not rooted in resentment. It does not frame the world as unfair or hostile, even though it often is. Instead, it frames life as unpredictable and demanding, but navigable. This emotional tone matters. Messages shaped by bitterness can inspire anger, but rarely endurance. What changes the way people think is not merely the content of the message, but its source. Advice about patience and persistence can sound hollow when delivered by someone who has not faced instability. When it comes from someone who has lived through uncertainty and still speaks calmly about time and growth, it carries a different weight. The message also subtly redefines success. Success is not portrayed as a single moment of recognition or wealth, but as the ability to sustain oneself, to adapt, and to continue choosing forward motion. This definition is more inclusive and, paradoxically, more demanding. It requires responsibility over a longer span rather than intensity over a short one. In reflecting on this message, many people report a sense of relief. Not relief from effort, but relief from unrealistic pressure. The pressure to have everything figured out, to peak early, to avoid mistakes. When that pressure eases, energy becomes available for learning and experimentation. Creativity thrives when fear of permanent failure recedes. There is also an ethical dimension to this outlook. When people believe they have time, they are more likely to invest in others, to mentor, to build sustainably rather than extractively. Urgency often produces short-term thinking. Patience allows for stewardship. It is important to note that this message does not deny privilege or structural advantage. May Musk's story includes opportunities that many do not have. However, the core principle is not about equal outcomes, but about internal orientation. Regardless of circumstances. The belief that growth can continue changes how one responds to obstacles. Ultimately, the message attributed to Elon Musk's mother does not promise transformation. It invites it. It does not guarantee success. It legitimizes persistence. It shifts the question from "why am I not there yet?" to "what can I continue building from where I am now?" That shift alone can change how a person thinks about their life. It replaces urgency with continuity, shame with curiosity, and fear with resolve. It encourages people to remain in conversation with their future selves rather than judging themselves by a single moment in time. In a culture saturated with instant results and constant comparison, such a message stands out precisely because it refuses to compete for attention. It waits. And in waiting, It teaches that the most meaningful changes in how we think often arrive not as revelations, but as quiet permissions we did not know we were allowed to grant ourselves. She didn't speak about success the way people usually do. There was no checklist, no dramatic declaration about destiny. It was quieter than that, almost ordinary, which is why it lingered. She talked about mornings when nothing seemed to work, about standing in kitchens and wondering if anyone would ever see the effort. She talked about raising children while building a life from fragments, about the invisible labor that never makes headlines. She said that when Elon was young, there were days he disappeared into books and ideas so deeply that the world forgot him, and days when the world pushed back hard enough to make her worry. What stayed with her wasn't brilliance. It was persistence without applause. She said she learned early that confidence doesn't arrive fully formed, it's borrowed from someone who believes in you before you believe in yourself. Her message circled back to patience. Not the passive kind, but the stubborn kind. The kind that keeps moving even when results lag behind effort. She admitted there were moments when she questioned her own choices, when stability felt far away and the future looked unreasonably demanding. But she said something unexpected: doubt wasn't a signal to stop. It was a signal to listen more closely to what mattered. She spoke about letting people be misunderstood for a while. About how growth often looks like failure from the outside. She said society rushes to label outcomes but rarely understands processes. When you're in the middle of becoming something, you rarely look impressive. You look unfinished, inconvenient, sometimes even foolish. She mentioned that she never tried to mold her children into what the world admired. She tried to make them resilient enough to survive when admiration disappeared. She said encouragement isn't about praise, it's about permission. Permission to try again. Permission to rest. Permission to change direction without shame. The message shifted toward independence. She said she didn't teach them to chase comfort. She taught them to chase curiosity and responsibility. Comfort, she said, is often just fear wearing soft clothes. Curiosity asks harder questions and demands braver answers. Responsibility keeps you grounded when curiosity pulls you too far ahead. She reflected on how easy it is to compare beginnings with someone else's endings. She warned that comparison steals clarity. You start measuring your worth by timelines that were never meant for you. She said every meaningful life moves at its own pace, and forcing speed only creates shallow victories. There was a moment when she talked about loneliness. Not as a tragedy, but as a teacher. She said some paths require walking alone for a while because they haven't been built yet. If you wait for company before you move, you may never start. Loneliness, she said, sharpens focus and reveals whether your motivation is real. She spoke gently about failure. Not as an enemy, but as an editor. Failure removes what doesn't belong. It simplifies you. It strips away the parts of your ambition that were borrowed from other people's expectations. What survives failure is usually closer to who you actually are. She reminded listeners that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in routines, in showing up again after disappointment, in choosing integrity when shortcuts are available. She said she trusted consistency more than talent, because talent can abandon you when things get difficult. Toward the end of that part of the message, she said something that reframed everything. Success is not proof that you were right. It's proof that you stayed curious, stayed responsible, stayed willing to be uncomfortable longer than most people. She paused, and in that pause was the weight of lived experience. Not theory. Not branding. Just the quiet authority of someone who had watched dreams struggle before they soared. By the time the message reaches its quiet ending, it no longer feels like advice meant only for her son. It feels like something left on a kitchen table for anyone who might need it. The power of it isn't in famous names or impossible achievements, but in how ordinary the wisdom sounds when stripped of mythology. She doesn't talk about changing the world as a goal. She talks about getting through the day without lying to yourself. About learning to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. About choosing effort even when applause is absent. What changes the way you think is realizing how much of greatness is built from unglamorous repetition. She reminds him that confidence didn't arrive all at once, and courage didn't appear fully formed. They were practiced, like a muscle strengthened by use. Each time he failed and kept going, each time he was misunderstood and stayed curious instead of bitter, something solid was quietly being built. Not a legacy, but a spine. There's a tenderness in how she frames ambition. She doesn't warn him against dreaming big, but she warns him against confusing scale with meaning. Bigger isn't always better. Louder isn't always braver. Sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is to stay honest when shortcuts are available, to remain kind when cruelty would be easier, to keep learning when ego insists you already know enough. She writes about fear as if it were an old acquaintance, not an enemy. Fear shows up, she says, when you're close to something that matters. The goal isn't to eliminate it, but to stop letting it make decisions for you. She reminds him that fear once tried to keep her small too, and that listening to it would have cost her the life she eventually built. That part lingers, because it reframes fear not as a signal to stop, but as proof that you're standing at the edge of growth. Near the end, her words slow down. The tone shifts from guidance to reassurance. She tells him he doesn't owe the world perfection. He doesn't need to be right all the time, or strong all the time, or certain all the time. What matters is returning to what feels true, again and again, even after wandering far from it. Progress, she implies, is less about speed and more about direction. The final lines aren't dramatic. There's no sweeping conclusion, no claim about destiny. Just a reminder that life is long, longer than most people think when they're young and driven and impatient. There is time to course correct. Time to rest. Time to begin again. Success, she suggests, is not a single moment you arrive at, but a way you move through the world without abandoning yourself, and that's what stays with you after the message ends. Not the fame, not the rockets, not the fortune, but the image of a mother quietly telling her child that who you become matters more than what you build, and that the truest measure of a life is whether you can look at it honestly and say, I tried, I learned, and I did not give up on what I believed was possible.